It has been a back and forth day for President Donald Trump's proposed tariffs, but the end result is that we will, it looks like, see 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada and 10% on China starting this weekend. For more, we're bringing in Ernie Tedeschi, Director of Economics for the Budget Lab at Yale University and former Chief Economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors under the Biden administration. Ernie, thank you so much for being here. We're all trying to make sense of this, obviously. One of the things we're trying to make sense of is what effect it will have on regular people, right? We were just talking about lots of different imports that come to us from Canada and Mexico. I always think of avocados. We eat a lot of avocados in my house. But how do you go about quantifying it, and what will be the hit potentially for U.S. households?
Yeah, so I think about the aggregate hit, and then I think about the timing. So in aggregate, when you think about the average household's basket, 25% on Canada, Mexico, 10% on China translates to about a 0.8% increase in the overall price level. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but you translate that for the average household, and that's about a $1,300 loss in purchasing power every year. That's a meaningful amount. That's about half a year of normal inflation happening in one fell swoop. In terms of timing, I think that households will see disposable items like groceries, like the fresh produce that you mentioned from Mexico, that will increase in price very quickly. Whereas I think more of the durable goods, like cars and auto parts, that will take some time for consumers to see the prices reflect tariffs, because automakers and retailers will work through the tariff-free inventory that they already have before they get to the tariffed inventory.
Ernie, why do you think Trump supports tariffs so wholeheartedly the way he does? Is it because he thinks they're revenue raisers, encourage domestic manufacturing, national security, all of the above?
All of the above. I think that he sees it as a way to protect domestic industry and as a way to raise revenue. The problem with that is that those two goals are in conflict with one another. If tariffs work as advertised to reduce imports and protect American industry, then by definition, you're not raising as much money from tariffs to offset what the purpose is this year, which is to pay for the extension of the 2017 tax cuts. I would note that as advertised, this slate of tariffs would probably raise about $1.5 trillion over 10 years if it were fully implemented on all goods, including oil, and stayed in place for 10 years. That's only about a third of the cost of extending the 2017 tax cuts. And then if you start talking about exemptions on top of that, exempting oil, exempting specific companies, you're going to raise even less, right? So this doesn't even come close to meeting the price tag of the tax cuts they're talking about.
Ernie, there are a lot of, obviously, just encapsulated in your answer there's still a lot of questions here, right? Are there going to be exemptions? What is this going to mean for inflation? What is it going to mean for collection of tariff revenue? One of the other questions is around growth, right? And looking back at the first round of tariffs under the first Trump administration, we saw the Federal Reserve, and this comes to us courtesy of Bloomberg, we saw the Federal Reserve changing its 2019 GDP growth targets, kind of trying to tweak them as we got the different tariffs and tried to figure out what the effect would be on growth. Ultimately, they brought the estimates lower. What do we know this time, or what is it going to hinge on this time, I guess, in terms of the hit to growth?
Yeah, it's a good question. On the one hand, these are bigger tariffs than the Trump administration proposed or tried to implement the first time around. Our estimate is that this slate, again, assuming that it was implemented on all goods, would probably translate eventually to a lower level of real GDP of 0.2% in the medium term. And by that, I mean like after 3 or 4 years. So that's meaningful. On the other hand, the Fed has said that in terms of inflation, it's going to try to look through the tariffs, meaning that it sees tariffs as a one-time price level increase, not inflationary, but just something that affects the price level once. And so it doesn't really affect its inflation mandate. Now, that is, the way that the monetary policy book is written, and that's certainly, the proper way to conduct monetary policy. I worry that the actual data are going to get messy because, CPI and PCE doesn't cooperate and tell you what inflation is X tariffs or X imports. It's all mixed together. And so I think that Fed is going to have a hard time this year, worrying about a soft landing, distinguishing between tariff effects versus immigration effects versus deficit effects versus who knows what other price effects might be coming up this year that we haven't even anticipated yet.
Ernie, I've heard some economists suggest that Trump has the leverage here in this back and forth with Mexico and Canada. And the data point they'll bring up, Ernie, is they'll say, well, Mexico and Canada, they ship out more than 20% of their GDP to the U.S. and that no other countries on the planet even come close to that. Is that how you see it, Ernie?
No. Canada and Mexico are our number one export destinations. So, while certainly the United States does have leverage in a trade war with them, I would argue that Canada and Mexico are the countries with which we have the least amount of leverage because our manufacturers are the most dependent on them as customers. Remember, too, that when you, as you already mentioned before in the lead up, when one imposes a tariff, the dollar appreciates. And so that helps out consumers a little bit because it makes, imports cheaper. And so it offsets the cost of tariffs a little bit. But it ends up hurting U.S. manufacturers because it makes our exports more expensive overseas. So even if Canada and Mexico don't end up retaliating against us, the stronger dollar is going to disadvantage our exporters. And, I think it's naive to assume that Canada and Mexico won't retaliate against us. Of course they will. They have no reason not to retaliate against us. And so that will directly hurt our manufacturers, which could lead to less investment and layoffs in the manufacturing sector.
Ernie, thanks so much for your perspective on all of this as we await the official announcement and see how it plays out. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.